Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Ohio State University Professor Emeritus of Ecology, Peter Curtis. Peter has studied the effects of climate on plants and ecosystems for over 30 years and authored more than 100 scientific publications in this field. He also serves on Kestrel's Board of Trustees. So welcome, Peter, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. I'm just going to go right to my share screen and we can get started. Welcome, everybody. Let's see. I go to here, share. And let's, is that, we're seeing my slide?
Yes.
Looks good, Marilyn. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Marilyn. It's great to be here and talking to everybody about a topic that is very interesting to me as we think about climate and the risk of the plants around us, and perhaps we'll ask the question, who might be at risk, who might be resilient among the plants in our environment, and what are some of the factors that influence the resilience or risk that plants face as the climate is changing. So I'm just going to launch into this with let's see if I have I don't know if I can do this. Here we go. I'd like to start just by making a few comments about my background very quickly. As Marilyn mentioned, I'm a botanist. My PhD is in botany from University of California, Davis. For the last couple of decades, I've been thinking pretty carefully about questions relating to climate and forest and carbon cycling in forests as they age in response to climate change. And a lot of this work was done in northern lower Michigan. We created various sorts of carbon exchange budgets like you see in this diagram on the right. And so that was quite a bit of what we did as a forest ecologist, thinking about carbon cycling and carbon dynamics. I've also spent time working on how the direct effects of rising CO2 on plants. We did work on a salt marsh for a while. That was interesting. We've also looked at how individual species respond in terms of their flowering time to changes in temperature as well. So these are phenological changes. So a variety of questions having to do with climate change and plants and ecosystems. But today I'm going to focus on climate and resilience and thinking about the flora that we see, particularly in Massachusetts, and the risks that some of these plants might face. And this is a bit of a roadmap for the presentation that I'm going to just sort of step through, and then we can get started. So first, I'd like to spend a little time in what I call deep time ecology, thinking about where our plants, the plants in our environment here in Massachusetts and New England came from and where they might be going. And so this sort of puts things in perspective. And as we think about plants moving across the landscape, we have to think about their dispersal characteristics, how plants actually migrate. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those sorts of traits and how they might relate to risk or resilience to climate change as plants have different strategies for migrating. After that, I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about some recent work done in Franklin County, Massachusetts by a group of botanists who have examined how this flora has changed over the last 200 years. And this provides some real insights into which sorts of plants are increasing in abundance or declining in abundance, and to some extent why that might be the case. And so we take advantage of some very extensive work done into the 19th century. We're fortunate to be in a place in Massachusetts which has a long history of botanical research, and then taking advantage of some really spectacular work done much more recently. So this is a comparative analysis. So we'll be thinking about insights from Franklin County that I think are generalizable. Then sort of extending from that, we're going to take a deeper dive into some orchid biology. There are sort of iconic species here and also emblematic of plants which are doing okay, and some other species which are not doing okay, and some lessons that we might learn from that. So a little bit of a deep dive into orchids, and they're also a particular favorite of mine. And then I'd like to conclude with asking the questions, what are the ecological solutions? What are some of the steps that we might take to help our local flora. So with that, let's go back in time a little bit, and I think it's instructive to appreciate that 19,000 years ago, height of the last glaciation, there were no plants in New England. New England was covered with ice. So, there's an interesting work being done. What was that land ice margin like? What were the plants like there? But suffice it to say that there were no plants in New England. So what that means is everything that's here now, all the trees, all the forbs, all the shrubs, came here from someplace else, for the most part from the south. So they've all migrated here in the last 10,000 years, although that migration is ongoing. So most of these plants have come from the southeast, from the Appalachians, from refugia during the Ice Age. So at some level, and I think it's instructive to think about this, we might ask the question, given that all of our flora, all of the plants around us have migrated here in the last thousands of years, should our plants be better able to respond to climate change than plants, for example, that didn't migrate? There are lots of rare endemic species. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this in the Appalachians and the Smokies, for example, that are small populations which are not found in New England presently that might be. So something just to keep in mind, are those more at risk? Should we be thinking about them as we think about risks to our own species that are around us now? So a little bit of deep ecology. Our plants all came here from someplace else in the last number of thousands of years. So how do we think about resilience to climate change? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this example because it's a plant that we know a lot about, and it shows a number of characteristics that I think are important to realize. And the example that I'm using is Virginia pine, which is a species which doesn't currently occur in New England. But as you'll see in a minute, it might in the future. And all these examples, the information I'm going to be presenting to you comes from the USDA Forest Service, their Climate Change Atlas, which is a phenomenal resource online. Anybody can visit this. And in fact, it mostly concerns woody plants. They also have another section on birds. So they've looked at bird responses to climate change. But I'm just going to be looking at this one example from Virginia pine. And so what you're looking at in this map is a map of the current distribution of this very important, it's a timber tree, but it has a fairly restricted distribution. As you can see, it just extends up into Pennsylvania, down into Georgia, and into Louisiana, but not too far. So it's fairly constrained. And we know a lot about this species. Now, if you look up at the top here, the northern distribution, that's the northern range limit of Virginia pine, sort of central Pennsylvania. And typically in ecology, we think about this northern range limit as being mostly determined by things like temperature and moisture. So what we refer to as abiotic factors. So that low temperature tolerances, for example, possibly, that would be the primary driver as we think about northern range limits. And as we think about climate change, as the climate is warming, we might expect that this northern range limit expands north so that new habitat might become available north of this northern range limit, given that the thinking is that this is primarily driven by temperature effects, low temperature effects. Now that's in contrast to the southern range limit down here. And again, standard ecological theory would posit or would predict that it's mostly things like competition from other species, other plants, maybe predation or herbivory, diseases that are the primary determinant of that southern range limit. But again, standard predictions is as climate changes, you might expect that this southern range limit contracts to the north, perhaps leaving these southern populations near the southern range high and dry. In other words, they would no longer be in suitable habitat. Up here in the north, you might have opportunities to migrate further north, although depending on the level of local adaptation, the species here, the populations here, might also find themselves needing to migrate to maintain their preferred habitat. But northern and southern range limits. So this is what we're looking at for Virginia pine. right now constrained to the Appalachians largely. But what do we think about as the possibilities for this plant that we know a lot about? How might it shift with a changing climate? So the way climate scientists approach this, and foresters and the Forest Service, is to initially model that current habitat. So you throw all the different factors, climate, biology, disturbance, into a model to try to predict where it's currently occurring. And these models are getting increasingly useful and good, and they duplicate quite well the current distribution. And then you run that forward with a climate model. And so in this case, I've shown you their predicted distribution, predicted habitat, given a fairly high emission scenario. So this is taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of their high emission scenarios, but one that's not unlikely to occur by the end of this century, maybe early into the next century. So that's the modeled future habitat. And what you can see, the green area is suitable habitat for Virginia pine. So under this scenario, Massachusetts would now be perfectly suitable habitat for Virginia pine, well up into Maine, and in fact, actually in the upper Great Lakes as well. Interestingly, there's some new habitat in the West and potentially even further south. And I don't know the details of why that is in this model, but you can see where this is going, that in the North, you have an increased opportunity for colonization, available habitat for this species. Now, the question then arises, could Virginia pine actually make its way there? And one of the measures that we used to think about that for plants is how fast do plants need to migrate? How fast do they actually need to move to avail themselves of this new habitat? And a measure of that is something called climate change velocity. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about that, but it's based on trying to estimate how fast an organism, plant or animal, would need to move to keep track with its preferred habitat. So in this case, it's sort of marching north. How fast would that have to be? And this varies according to where you are, and you can sort of see this on the map down here, again, without going into a lot of detail. It varies with topography as well, but an average rate, which is probably pretty close to the truth, or to, I think it seems reasonable anyway, for New England, for a plant to migrate across the New England landscape to keep pace with climate change under a high emission scenario would be about a mile a year. So we think about that as a migration rate to keep track of a warming climate. Now, okay, so a mile a year, does that sound like a lot or a little? Well, again, a number which I was looking up, the distance between central Pennsylvania, where Virginia pine currently sort of northern range limit, and western Massachusetts, about 300 miles. So at a mile a year, it may take a little while to get there. So again, just some sort of numbers to keep in mind as we think about how plants migrate and where they may need to go. This is a plant that we know a lot about. And just to finish the analysis with Virginia pine, this is again emblematic of a species that has a lot of work has been done. We know a lot about how it grows and what its tolerances are. So the Forest Service has come up with an adaptability metric, and this is up here in the left-hand circle here of 3.8, sort of moderately adaptable. And this is based on an analysis of lots of different characteristics of this plant, how it responds to fire, for example. And the greens here mean that sort of a positive for its adaptability. Reds are negative, so it's very shade intolerant. So that's a negative. Seedling establishment, pretty good. Over here, disturbance, it responds reasonably well to drought, but very poorly to pollution. So all of these factors can be put into an analysis about the adaptability, the resilience of this species to climate change. And they give a very useful interpretation, which I'm just going to summarize quickly. So in the case of Virginia pine, again, we know a lot about this. We can parameterize the model that has to do with all these different factors. This species was judged moderately adaptable with fair capability to cope with climate change, but comes with this caveat that this newly suitable habitat in New England is not likely to get naturally colonized over the next 100 years. It's simply too far away. Our climate change velocity is too high. So while it's adaptable to climate change, it's clearly limited in terms of its ability to frack its habitat, at least as it's moving north. So this is a species that we know a lot about. The reality is that for the vast majority of our native species of plants around us, and we're going to get into some of the examples of this, we can only guess at their climate change resilience. In other words, we don't have all this information about drought resistance or its competitive abilities. But we can clearly identify some risk factors as we think about the likelihood that a given species would be able to react or be resilient to climate change or be able to migrate to new habitat if where they're currently growing becomes unsuitable. And not surprisingly, one of the characteristics is the seed dispersal methods. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this. So that's how plants move, by dispersing their seeds for the most part. Occasionally it's by vegetative propagation, but distances, it's almost always reliant on seed dispersal. Whether or not a population is near that southern range limit and really risks being out of its climate zone as that range limit contracts north, that would be a risk factor as well. So a northern species at its southern range limit, that may be a problem. We're seeing that actually in New England. Its rarity, is it a rare species? It is a small population, an isolated population. Those rare small populations have a much greater likelihood of going extinct or going locally extinct than do widespread populations. So its population dynamics, the genetic resources in these small populations are important as well. Can it adapt to that climate change? So rarity is certainly important as well. And lastly, and there's a variety of other factors, but as we'll see this plays out in orchids, symbioses. Many plants have specific sorts of symbioses, often with fungi, and whether or not those symbioses can be maintained intact as climate changes is an important one. Other factors, pollinators, other specific specificities become important as to whether a plant can occupy a new environment. If its pollinators aren't there, if its symbionts aren't there, it becomes much more less likely. So in this case, specialists are typically thought of as being greater risk than our generalists in this regard. So these are some risk factors, and we'll be going over some of these as they relate to specific species. Okay, so let's see if I can advance my slide. Oh, here we go. Let's I want to spend a little bit of time talking about seed dispersal methods, because this figures in rather importantly as we think about migration of species, and it also helps us predict which species are going to be at risk. It's also is a great illustration of how botanists in particular love jargon. And so seed dispersal methods have all been given different names, and the suffix, this botanical suffix, is "chori," which is a Greek for movement. And so for animal dispersal, this is referred to in botany as zoochori. And about 35 to 40% of the species in the Northeast use animal dispersal. So this would be some familiar species like winterberry or doll's eye, which are being dispersed through the gut of animals, birds for the most part, or outside of animals, things like burdock and other seeds which hang on to people or animals. And so we also, so animal dispersal is important in or on animals. We can also, using a variety of methods, try to estimate the distance that these particular dispersal methods can actually move seeds. And this is difficult, but there have been a variety of ways of estimating this. And I've taken some data from actually flora in Switzerland. It was a pretty decent study, and they're fairly similar species to ours, or have, it's a north temperate flora. And there they estimate somewhere between 200 and 1,500 meters as this outside distance that seeds would be dispersed using animal dispersal. This would be 90% of the seeds get no further than 1,500 meters. So 1.5 kilometers, pretty decent distance. There's a long tail to this. So clearly there can be some rare instances where seeds are moved by birds, for example, much longer distances. But for the most part, 50%, less than on the order of 2 meters, 90% are gone or on the ground again, have been dispersed by 1,500 meters, and then some rare number, some small numbers longer than that. So that's animal dispersal. An interesting subset, and important for our flora, and this is a subset of animals, although it's given its own category, seed dispersal by ants, myrmecory. And some of our really sort of iconic species here in New England have used this specialized adaptation for ant dispersal. About 10% of our flora, things like trillium and bloodroot, both are ant dispersed species in which the seeds have a specialized fatty body that the ants go for, and then the ants will drop the seeds along the way or sometimes cache them. But they're eating this elaiosome, this specialized body on the seed. And ants are very good dispersals, but they don't go very far. So 15 meters, maybe the maximum that you would expect seed dispersal by ants. So important ones for our plants, and we're going to get back to this. Wind dispersal is another one. Animacory, maybe 18-20% of our species are wind dispersed. Familiar plants like maples or fireweed or orchids with their dust seeds are wind dispersed. We'll get back to that. Maybe half a kilometer at most. Again, with rare instances where it can go much further than that if they get lofted, seeds get lofted particularly high. So wind dispersal is another. And then the last one I want to talk about, this is not an exhaustive list, is but it is typical for some of the species in our area where there's no known external vector, autocory. Maybe 40% of our species, things like jewelweed or touch-me-not, which shoot their seeds out a little distance. Violets also have an explosive dehiscence. Something like a bladderpod, as far as I can tell, just opens up and drops the seed straight down. So these distances here are much less. So maybe 5 meters, 0.1 to 5 meters as a distance. So these are all different ways that plants migrate or move their seeds, and would be important as we think about their resilience and their risk to climate change. Are they able to migrate and move into new environments? Okay, so keeping all that in mind, I want to turn to this set of studies that was really taken on by botanists in the area. It was spearheaded by Robert Burton, who's at Holy Cross College in Worcester. And what they did, and they were focusing here on Franklin County, Massachusetts. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with this because I think it really does illustrate the risks and resilience of different species. But they looked at historic records of the occurrence of plants in the 26 different towns in Franklin County. And then starting in 2010, they sent people into the field and they looked for upwards of 1,100, almost 1,200 species of native plants in each of these towns, and compared what they found between 2010 and 2019 with records going back into the 19th century. So what had been there historically. So they either recorded plants that were there historically and they found again with the black, closed black symbols, plants that were there historically, but they failed to find them, so they disappeared. They're no longer there. Or conversely, plants that were not recorded in that town historically, but have appeared there in this most recent survey. So the example here is our wood lily, Lilium philadelphicum. And what you can see here are the 26 towns. And you can see in some cases where where this plant was recorded historically, it's now disappeared. Those are the open circles. And some where it was recorded historically, where they found them, those are the closed circles. And in other cases where there was no historical record, but it now has appeared, and those are the crosses. And in the case of Lilium, you have an equal number of cases where they've disappeared and they've appeared. And then there's a number of cases, number of towns where, again, they were there before and they're there now. And they use all this data to calculate a change index over this 2 centuries, where I don't go into the math of the change index, but if that change index is 0, there was no change. Doesn't mean there was no change in their distribution, but there was no net change in the number of towns that this plant occurred in. If it's less than 1, it's declining. If it's greater than 1, it's increasing. Hope everybody follows that. We'll see some examples of this. Again, I think it illustrates really nicely this pattern of occurrence and disappearance in the flora that we're experiencing, and we can think about this in the context of climate change. Just to cut to the chase a little bit, they looked at almost 1,200 native species, an enormous amount of work. I can't quite imagine it, getting out in the field and really finding all these species. They found that 67 species out of the 1,200 were lost. They no longer occur in Franklin County. 50 species, on the other hand, were not historically recorded that now are here. So a few more lost than have been gained. And one of the groups that is quite clearly disproportionately declining are orchids. And I was wanting to sort of look at orchids as we towards the end of the talk. So that's overall, but I'd like to examine some of these patterns of responses that I think illustrate what's going on with climate change, or perhaps not. So I want to just highlight 3 different contrasting patterns that Burton and his colleagues found as they looked at this flora in Franklin County. And the first is kind of the poster child for a northerly species that's declining, and that's twin flower. And I hope many of you have seen this. If you go to Maine or up into Canada, it's quite common, but it's uncommon and declining strongly in Massachusetts. And so that change index is negative right here. You can see negative 0.4. And here's what they found. So it used to be quite widely distributed in Franklin County down in the southern towns, and now is restricted to these 3 towns in the northern part of the state. So it's disappeared from 5 and appeared in 1 new one. So it went from 7 to 3, basically, or 8 to 3. No, 7 to 3. So that's twin flower. And this has a very northern distribution. So it's mostly a northern distributed species. And in fact, it used to be found in the southern part of Massachusetts. It's gone from all these southern locations. Is this an indication of climate change? Possibly. We'll see another example of this. On the other hand, sort of to contrast with that, white vervain, a verbena species, is common. It had been reasonably common in Massachusetts, and it's increasing. It's now found in essentially every single town in Franklin County. It's primarily a southerly distributed species. So as with twin flowers, sort of adhering to what we might think of as a pattern of climate change, where at northern species it's at the southern part of its range, so it's contracting northwards. A southern species is moving north, is actually expanding its range into the north. So both of these examples conform to what we might expect with climate change, with that expansion of the northern range, contraction in the southern range limits of the species. White vervain is also a species known to colonize disturbed habitats, something we call a weedy or rutteral species. These tend to be the ones that are also increasing in our state, for better or worse. Finally, another species, not a particularly, well, it's actually quite uncommon in Massachusetts, has always been relatively uncommon. It's a northerly distributed species. Again, I think probably many of you are familiar with this, Rhodora, or Rhododendron canadense. It's as a northerly distribution, not particularly common here. It disappeared from 2 sites, appeared in 2 more, and stayed put in 2 of their towns where it had been seen previously. So its change index is 0. There's been no net change, although there's been some shifting around within the county, within Franklin County. So those are 3 different possible patterns, and we can try to intuit or interpret those with respect to climate change or other characteristics of these species. In some cases we can do that, in other cases we simply have to guess. I'd like now, just the last sort of analysis of this data set, is to look at differences among orchid species. And as I mentioned, these are all orchids as a group are declining. One species which is not declining, is doing reasonably well, is the pink lady slipper orchid. Again, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It's an iconic species. It's broadly distributed. It's common in Massachusetts, common across New England. It was common historically. It's actually expanded its range a little bit. You can see these crosses, the dark crosses, new towns where it hadn't been recorded previously, where it's now found. So here's a orchid that seems to be doing quite well. And it's broad in its distribution. We're not near the northern or southern range limit of this species. Contrast that with the ram's head lady slipper, which I'll admit I've never seen in the wild, or I haven't seen it at all. It's a state endangered listed species, not federally listed. It has a very strong northern distribution, as we'll see in a second, where Massachusetts is basically at its southern range limit. It was never common here, and it's even less common now. So it was historically known from 2 sites. Now it's only known from 1 site down in the southern part of the county. Its change index is also strongly negative, so it's lost half of its distribution in Franklin County, and this is emblematic of the state. Another orchid, showy lady slipper orchid, also state endangered, strongly negative change index. Unlike the ram's head lady slipper, so it's got a broad distribution. We're not in either the northern or the southern range limit, but as you can see from the map here, almost all of the sites where it was previously seen, it's no longer found. It's only located now in 1 town in the northern part of the county. So again, this is not necessarily a rare species to the north of us or other places, but it has declined for whatever reason strongly within the state of Massachusetts, and particularly in Franklin County. So 3 different patterns of behavior across these orchids. So when we look at the overall analysis from Burton and colleagues' work in Franklin County, what were some of the things that they concluded when they looked at these species and the traits that they possessed to explain whether this pattern of either increase or decrease? So one of the things that really stood out the most strongly for them in their analysis, and actually in other papers as well that Dr. Burton and his students and colleagues have worked on in Worcester County, for example, that northern species are declining relative to other species. So in this case, species which for Massachusetts, with their southern range limit, they seem to be strongly declining relative to other species. Windflower is a good example of that, but there are others. Dispersal mechanism also turned out to be significant, where plants with bird dispersed seeds, zoochori, seem to be increasing relative to those which relied on ant dispersal. And those 2 methods of seed dispersal seem to shake out as being risk factors, or in one case, plants that were using animals to disperse their seeds seem to be increasing relative to those that relied on ant dispersal. Similarly, plants that had a strong symbiotic relationship with fungi, plants that we refer to as being mycoheterotrophic, strongly reliant on fungi for providing their resources, nutrients, particularly even carbon at different times of their life, especially orchids, appear to be declining relative to others that aren't so strongly symbiotic or have this strong dependency on fungi, so that are non-mycoheterotrophic. So that seems to be a risk factor. And finally, as with vervain, annuals, weedy species seem to be increasing relative to long-lived perennial species. So those are some broad trends that came out of this analysis, this beautiful analysis of the Franklin County flora, using historic records, herbarium records, and then a contemporary survey fieldwork that was done there. So we get this sort of broad picture of what may be going on in Franklin County, species moving around, some consistent with what we would expect from climate change based on some of their traits. I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into orchids, since they are declining specifically, and they have some biological characteristics which can reveal essentially weird biology from my standpoint, that it seems unlikely that they could survive and persist given their particular syndromes. And so we're going to take a little bit of a detour into orchid biology. It's also one of my hobbies. So pollination systems, seed and seedling dynamics, fungal symbionts, habitat requirements. These are all attributes of orchids, which in many cases set them apart from other species. And we know perhaps of all the slipper orchids, and there are a whole bunch of them, 15 in North America, 4 or 5 in the East here. We know the most about the pink lady slipper orchids, the most common of these. And you can see in this map here, the distribution. I mentioned this before. It's broadly distributed, goes way south, goes well up into Canada, the Western provinces. So lady slipper orchid is an incredible organism. I've been following this now for a while. But let me start with a little brief overview about how orchids attract pollinators. Of course, these are necessary for the persistence of the species. So most orchids, maybe 70%, it's a huge family, tens of thousands of species, most of them in the tropics, and most of them provide a reward to attract a pollinator. And that's sort of the standard way that we think about plant pollinator interactions. There should be nectar or pollen or something that rewards a insect or a bird or whatever for visiting that flower. So many of them provide nectar. Orchids are crazy that they often provide things like oils and other compounds. These euglossine bees are harvesting oils that are part of their mating rituals. So most do sort of the normal thing, but a sizable number, including the slipper orchids, don't. They provide no reward for a visiting insect or bird. They rely on deception to attract pollinators. And in the case of slipper orchids, this is food deception. So a visiting bee or fly would expect to find nectar based on the color and nectar guides. But when they arrive there, they find nothing. And there's no harvestable pollen either. So this is referred to as food deception. There's a particularly oddball group of orchids, mostly in Australia, which mimic female insects. In this case, it's an illustration of a wasp. So male wasp will attempt to mate with the flower, and in so doing, end up pollinating it. And also, of course, there are no larval or wasp offspring from this, so the wasp is not getting a whole lot from it. And it's probably tells us something about male wasps, but in any case, sexual deceit is another orchid adaptation. So how does the pink lady slipper orchid actually do this? And I just find this remarkable, this even ever works. So just bear with me as I step us through the process for pink lady slipper orchids. So the pink lady slipper orchids actually have a fairly specific pollinator that they work with. They're bumblebees, queen bumblebees. They have to be a particular size and quite large, actually. Usually, and they're naive in the sense that they haven't visited these flowers before. They come out in the spring. They're hungry. They need to provision their nest. And so this queen bumblebee will enter the flower through the lips here and in searching for pollen or nectar. It looks like a perfectly good candidate for that. At which point she gets trapped inside the flower. She can't exit the same way that she went in. And she'll hunt around. She'll fight around in here for a while, trying to find nectar or pollen, finds nothing. In order to exit, she has to squeeze herself through this little exit hole at the very top of the flower where she can actually, light is coming through. And in doing so, she'll pass a sticky bundle of pollen called a pollinium, and that sticks to her thorax, to her back. So she escapes through this snug little hole carrying a pollinium, but she's no longer naive. She's thinking, well, I didn't get anything from that. In order for her to be an effective pollinator, she has to do this again and to a different flower. And you have to, so she has to be deceived again, be willing to go through this whole process again. So my little cartoon, she now is, whoops, let me go back here. She's got a pollinium on her back. She ends up down in the flower with the pollinium. I skip through this too quickly. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Ends up depositing this, as she's pulling her way out, ends up depositing this pollinium on the stigma, the receptive surface, and then exits again. No longer naive. So that's what has to happen for this orchid to be pollinated. The pollinator gets nothing. It's remarkable that this works at all. So, but clearly it does. And if you're out in the woods and you happen across some lady slipper orchids, a large population of them, you might see a successfully pollinated orchid that looks like this. This is the developing fruit of a lady slipper orchid that's actually been pollinated. And actually the fruits, the capsules become quite woody and they persist over the winter. So you can see this last year's fruit with this year's flower for a plant that's been successfully reproduced. But it doesn't happen very often. So in the case of this orchid, and this is true for other orchids as well, most plants don't flower in any given year. And so if you get good at recognizing lady slipper orchids that aren't flowering, you'll notice that they're much more common than are the flowering individuals. So this is a picture of a whole bunch of non-flowering orchids. They're little strap-like leaves. And of the flowers of the plants that do flower, very low percentage of them actually set fruit, actually get pollinated, probably because of this crazy deception pollination mechanism. So maybe anywhere from 0%, which is not uncommon, to at most 10 to 15% of flowers will actually get pollinated. And you need to have a pretty high density of flowers for a bumblebee to visit one, then get to another and successfully transfer pollen. They're very far apart, essentially will never happen. Now, I do have to add, this is when my hobby comes in, it's quite easy to hand pollinate lady slipper orchids, pink lady slipper orchids in particular. And when you do that, you get 100% fruit set. So it's quite satisfying, and you can certainly propagate seed on your own from wild plants if you have permission to do this by hand pollinating. And I can go into details on that if anyone's interested. So it doesn't stop there, though, with what I'm calling crazy biology. Once the plant is pollinated, fruit is formed, seeds are produced. These seeds are incredibly small. We call them dust seeds. They're less than 2 micrograms each. A given capsule here might produce 40,000 of these tiny, tiny dust seeds that are obligate on a fungal symbiont. So for them to even germinate, let alone grow, they need to find the appropriate fungal symbiont in the soil. And even then, it takes 2 to 3 years, maybe longer, for them to even emerge above the soil and become photosynthetic. So they're living underground, subterranean, in symbiosis with a fungus for multiple years before they even emerge. So all these things have to happen in order for this plant to survive and persist. And at that point, it may take many, many years for it to flower. So the plants that you see, if you see a pink lady slipper orchid flowering, it's likely that that plant is at least 10 to 15 years old and possibly much older. And I've been engaged in trying to increase the number of orchids and property that we own in Maine by hand pollinating orchids and then distributing the seeds into what I think is suitable habitat. And I've been doing this for a number of years to date with no evidence success. But I persist, and it's a experiment of faith. And I'm sure at some point in time, some orchid will find its fungus and reward me with a new plant. But we'll see. So far, no such luck. Okay. So that's the pink lady slipper orchid, a little bit of its biology. Interesting, oddball pollination biology, particular seedling and recruitment dynamics, takes a long time, requires a symbiosis. It's remarkable that it's doing as well as it is. On the other hand, related species, the ram's head lady slipper, not doing well at all, certainly in Massachusetts. It's rare across its range. And these are just some of the possible risk factors that we might consider for a species like the ram's head lady slipper. It's got low genetic diversity. People who have studied this, perhaps a bottleneck post-glaciation is not clear. It rarely reproduces sexually. Probably some of the same reasons why pink lady slipper orchids set so little fruit. It has an apparent dependency on gaps in forests. It doesn't do well in deep shade. It also doesn't do well in bright sun. It relies on 1 or 2 trees coming down, a gap forming. These sorts of gaps naturally occurring from tree falls, perhaps becoming more rare as we manage our forests. The threats that have been identified by the Massachusetts Fish and Wildlife, at least, primarily target habitat loss, these particular kinds of gaps. Deer browse. Deer are heavily browse most of these orchids. Unfortunately, illegal collecting of orchids is a persistent problem. So if people find out where these are, they think they can transplant them, or which is almost always unsuccessful. The plants just die. And then for this species, we can also look at climate change. We're clearly at the southern part of its range distribution here. And so that may also be playing a factor. Showy lady slipper orchid, the other one that we considered, doesn't share that same distribution. So we can't think about ourselves being at the southern range limit. It's also state endangered. Its ecology, though, is also particular. It requires alkaline wetlands, which have been drained and are otherwise disturbed. It can clonally reproduce, unlike, for example, pink lady slipper orchid, so that might work in its favor. It also has a diversity of pollinators. It's not so heavily reliant on bumblebees, for example. So those might be positives. On the other hand, its particular habitat requirements very much under threat. Deer browsing has also been identified as a threat factor, as well as with these other orchids, illegal collecting. So as we think about the threats that these species are facing, climate change is one of them. Habitat loss, other threats, that are human-induced, or in this case, deer, for example, also clearly come into play. Okay, I guess we're wrapping up, and I hope we're doing well in time. Let's see where we are. I think, oh, that's not too bad. Ecological solutions, sort of the theme of the seminar series. There are some things that we can be doing, and it's really gratifying to know that in many cases these solutions, these approaches are being embraced. We're very fortunate in Massachusetts to have the Native Plant Trust. So increasing the numbers of native plants across the landscape, very important. Protects against local extinctions with small populations by increasing the number of native species. Provides habitat for other native species, pollinators, dispersers. So these are very important and are becoming to be more and more widely embraced. And we have access to native species to introduce to our landscape much more broadly now as well. Again, Native Plant Trust, we can look to them as well as other organizations that are making these things available, making these plants available. I think we need to pay particular pay attention to the health of pollinator species. I think most of us have heard about the widespread decline in insects. These are important pollinators, obviously. We need to be thinking about providing resources for these insects and recognizing, and this is now becoming much more part of the conversation, is that even weedy species in our lawns, clovers and dead nettles and so forth, can provide nectar resources at critical times for pollinators. And so shout out to No Mow May that's thinking about ways that we can pay attention to our pollinators, because without them, we're not going to get any seed set, and the ability of a plant to migrate, of course, is severely compromised. And then lastly, in this little group, I want to mention this idea of assisted plant migration. And there's some local botanists who've been thinking about this very carefully. And the question here is whether we should be thinking about moving vulnerable species, southern species, some of these endemic species from the Appalachians, northward into New England, where their preferred habitat may be coming in the next decades or as climate warms. Is this scalable? Can this be done? We know from horticulture and just people's gardens that many of these species that grow in the South can do perfectly well in Massachusetts, even in Maine. Should we be moving them wholesale to try to protect them as their native range further south of us is deteriorating their habitat there? So that's an interesting question. As well, people are asking, well, do these come with ecological risks? Is this something that we really want to embrace? What do we need to do before we can be sure that we aren't introducing, say, a new invasive species into our environment, or there may be some negative interaction with our species that are currently occurring here before we start moving species around? So very interesting discussion now about assisted plant migration as an active response to climate change, but thinking about what might be some of the downsides. So I want to mention that as well. And then finally, I think for me, this sort of supersedes almost all of these is greater habitat conservation. And here, just a acknowledgement to the late great E.O. Wilson, who wrote so eloquently about this in his book Half Earth, about the need to set aside more land for native species, wildlands than we're doing now. As he wrote, crucial factor in the life and death of species is the amount of suitable habitat left to them, and that as reserves, these set-aside lands grow in size, the diversity of life surviving within them also grows. Of course, the converse is true as well. As the available habitat shrinks, the diversity of life shrinks as well. And to end, just again, a positive note as we think about this idea of conservation, habitat conservation as a way of really confronting these challenges that species face with climate change. we're at the dawn of essentially a new set of tools, mapping tools, that are revolutionizing how we make decisions about where to put our conservation resources. And again, a shout out to what's going on in Massachusetts. The Division of Fisheries and Wildlife is a program called BioMap, where they're mapping crucial habitat, all sorts of different sorts of natural landscape components. Other groups are working with Mass Fish and Wildlife, University of Massachusetts groups, for example, also bringing to bear new mapping tools. And again, a shout out to Kestrel, our host here, utilizing these tools as we think about where we're going to put our conservation resources. And so on this map here, you can't see it very well, but the little red outlined squares are potential areas for conservation. The orange hatching here have been identified using BioMap, this mapping tool, as being part of a core habitat. We can start thinking about creating corridors and really prioritizing our resource conservation efforts. And this, I think, is going to have a real positive effect on the decision-making and the way that we're able to set aside lands. And Western Massachusetts is a great place to be in that regard, as we're making use of these tools now. So with that positive note, I think we can do it. Certainly improve our conservation efforts and set aside more lands. And with that, I think with that, I'm going to stop and thank everybody for attending. And if there are questions, we can start to look at those in the chat room.
Yeah, if you want to stop sharing your screen, Peter, I will go ahead and read what's in the chat here. Okay, great.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Peter, that was a wonderful presentation. I learned so much myself, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom. Great. One question is, I see garlic mustard everywhere in all caps along roadsides as I walk. How significant, how harmful is this plant?
Garlic mustard, interesting question. I have pulled my share of garlic mustard. I witnessed its expansion when I lived in Ohio as a professor at Ohio State. It was not there when we first moved there, it came in. It's turned out to be less of a problem in natural areas than we thought it would initially there. And it's been there now for, 30 years practically. It's an interesting problem. I mean, the question there is, there's almost nothing we can do. I mean, it's one of these things, you have to live with it. I'm much more concerned with the species I'm most concerned with now is Japanese knotweed, but the garlic mustard is it's here to stay. And so is it displacing other species? There's not a lot of good evidence that it is. It's not something that we like to see. There's been some interesting work. It's a very early flowering species that's starting to flower now. Other things are as well. There was some interesting work done showing that it's actually providing nectar resources for pollinators at a time, early May, late April, when there aren't too many other species flowering. I mean, there clearly are some. So, you're looking at, it's going to be impossible to eradicate. The damage done and pulling it up or you would never want to spray it with herbicide outweighs what I would think of as the damage that's being done. It does highlight, though, our need to really think about invasive species, because in some cases, I don't know that this is true necessarily with garlic mustard, but they clearly have negative impacts. But it's unfortunate, and we've seen it invade natural areas in Ohio. It looked like it was going to take off and remained in fairly low abundance, or even in fact declined. It's actually a pretty decent pot herb. So one solution, of course, to reduce the abundance of almost anything is to get people to want to pick it. And so if we could convince people to start putting this in their salads and things, that might be a way of dealing with garlic mustard.
One comment regarding the garlic mustard is that garlic mustard kills West Virginia white butterflies.
Does it really? They're feeding on their larvae. That would be the case, probably.
They're uncommon in Massachusetts, but nonetheless, Susan was just making known that.
A negative consequence there. I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. But again, it's once established as widely as garlic mustard is, we're going to basically have to live with it.
Mhm. Okay.
Right.
Kim is wondering where we can get a biomap for Western Mass.
Just go online. So if you Google biomap, Mass Fish and Wildlife, there are several sites, but that will take you right there, and you can actually, you have access to the mapping tool. The Nature Conservancy also has a mapping tool that they use on climate resilience estimates. Very interesting as well, worth going to see their site. The University of Massachusetts Amherst, my colleague Scott Jackson, also a Kestrel member, has worked up, he and his colleagues have pioneered a mapping program called CAPS, which actually they've incorporated part of CAPS into biomap. And so there's collaboration among these different groups, all with this very admirable goal of trying to identify the most significant habitat that we should be targeting our conservation efforts towards. Mm-hmm. Not all, at this stage, not all land is created equal. Mm-hmm. And we need to make use of these, or knowledge of the landscape, which is extensive in Massachusetts, doesn't always extend to other states. And this to me is just a missed opportunity. I was talking to some of our colleagues at Kestrel about this, and habitats don't stop at the border, but these are state efforts. This was the state of Massachusetts funding this, so it doesn't necessarily extend into New Hampshire or Maine. They've got their own efforts going, but I think there needs to be probably greater collaboration among states as we think about joining these efforts, which is ongoing, but it's very abrupt in the map that we're looking at with biomap.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Another person is wondering, do you have any information about the future of bunchberry given climate change?
Bunchberry. Well, I go back to look at the Burton et al. Manuscript. I mean, that's people are interested in propagating that. It's very common, in various areas. I have provided seed for colleagues in Maine, bunchberry seeds, which always I found it grows in abundance on my property in Maine, and I pick it and harvest it for my colleagues at the Wild Seed Project to increase its abundance. It's a spectacular plant. I imagine it has a northern distribution, so I'd have to look at what its distribution map. That's what I would look for. Is are we near the southern range limit of bunchberry? And someone else may know. Do you see it in Pennsylvania? I don't. I'd have to go look and look at the range map. Good question though. Great plant. I love it.
Kim says at Look Park, which is in Northampton, for those who aren't familiar with it, Look Park is growing Japanese knotweed in bulk. What should be done about that?
Oh, goodness. Oh, cut it down. We were struggling with knotweed here where I live in Northampton. They're working on biocontrol of knotweed. There's a group at UMass that are working on this with insects. They're with variable success. That would be, they've actually gotten permission to release, and I confess I don't remember what a beetle, I think, that eats knotweed. That would be ideal. But it's incredibly tenacious. I personally, when we have used basically plastic to smother it, if you have a dense stand, and that works. It takes multiple years. Basically, you're depleting the resources below ground. There's a very substantial below ground rhizome, below ground stems and roots that'll just continue to put up shoots. So you need to smother that. It's slowly depleting itself below ground, and eventually that'll kill the clone, the population. But you have to be persistent, and that's it's disruptive itself. I go in if I see a few, essentially a leading edge of a population. You can go and cut those. If you're persistent, you keep cutting the stems. Let them grow 2 or 3 feet so that they've invested the most that they're going to in that stem. Cut it down, and that's depleted the below ground a little bit in carbon. If you do that repeatedly, you should be compromising the plant. Eventually, it would die. But it takes a long time. They're incredibly tenacious. They can be killed with herbicides. Don't recommend that. And we hold out hope that they'll come up with a biological control that passes muster, that doesn't jump to something else. It's horrific. I was traveling in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton last summer. It's everywhere up there. It's like it's the northern version of kudzu. So it's alarming, and things do not grow underneath knotweed.
Wow. Thanks for that, Peter. Julie is wondering why only the queen bumblebee is successful in pollinating the pink lady slipper. Is the success related to the bee's size?
It is. It's a size. It's what, as I understand from the pollination description of pollination biology of pink lady slipper, the exit hole is large enough that a smaller pollinator wouldn't be forced to pick up that polonium. So it's the size of the bee. So smaller bees won't work. So these queen bumblebees, and there's a number of species, but their presence is important. And so if you're thinking about conserving lady slippers, you have to have habitat for these queen bumblebees, and they're usually ground nesting. So there needs to be some friable, some sort of sandy soil where these ground nesting queens overwinter. And so they're coming out in the early spring. This is one of the fairly early spring flowering, coincident with the emergence of these bumblebees. But it is it's a size issue. And there's a lot of work done on size of pollinators or potential pollinators who visit slipper orchids and whether they would ever qualify to be effective pollinators. And in terms of lady slippers, they have to be big, like a big bumblebee.
Okay.
I've never seen it happen. I'm still waiting. I've stocked it out, but it's very infrequent. I've seen bumblebees fly by and take a look. They never stop. So you got to be patient.
Good to know. Anne says that my family has spent 7 years eradicating knotweed from our road, doing 10 cuttings a year. Root system gets weaker.
It does get weaker. So that's been successful. To say that again, how long have they been working at it?
7.
7 years.
Doing 10 cuttings a year.
10 cuttings a year. That's a lot. That's a lot of work. But it's so far it's having a positive effect, or it's the knotweed is declining. Is that what she said?
Yes.
Yeah, good to hear.
Yeah, thanks for your diligence there, Anne. I like how you do it as a family.
Yeah.
Julie asks, are the invasive jumping earthworms possibly related to a decrease of orchids that need a mycorrhizal association?
Oh boy, earthworms, not just the jumping earthworms, it's a big topic, particularly in the Midwest. So all earthworms north of the glaciation, so where we are, and this was true in Michigan, where in Minnesota, where this problem was first described, the glaciers wiped out all the earthworms as well. So as the glaciers receded, there were no earthworms, and earthworms move even slower than plants do. And so where you see earthworms coming up, they're usually around lakes and streams where fisher people have deposited their bait. And these earthworms, any earthworms, but the jumping earthworms are just freaky, and they're not common enough now that we know what the negative impacts, but there's been clear work done mostly in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, showing the effects of earthworms on that upper humus layer of forest soils where many seeds and fungi occur. And so earthworms are very powerful in what we call bioturbation, I guess. So they're mixing the soil. They move things down in the soil column, move things up. In gardens, they're great. They have a dramatic effect on the forest soil surface, that what we call the O horizon and the A horizon. And that can have dramatic consequences on not just lady slippers, but many of our spring ephemerals, which appear to be declining in area of recent earthworm invasions. Again, once they're there, there's almost nothing you can do to keep them out. There's been increased awareness among people who fish not to throw their worms into lakes and streams because they don't die, they take up residence there. These jumping earthworms, Very freaky. I haven't encountered any yet, but from what I understand, they would be even worse. But the problem of earthworms is, again, it's another, we're reluctant to call them invasive species. They may be native to areas south of here, but it's not clear that how adapted our native northern flora is to these very potent, they're almost ecological engineers as they move, as they mix the soil. It's a bit of a debate, particularly among gardeners who we'd like to see earthworms. Forest systems, particularly undisturbed forests, maybe not so much.
Susan says we need another ice age to exile the worms.
I've worked with people who study this, and counting earthworms is an interesting process. One of the ways it's done is to pour basically diluted mustard into the soil, and it irritates the earthworms, and they'll come bubbling to the surface, or some number of them do. So then you grab them and count them and so forth. It's not lethal. Or you can send electric currents through the soil is another way of doing it. Not an easy thing to study, but the difference between invaded soil, earthworms invasion, and uninvaded soils can be, in some cases, really dramatic. It's less severe where the soils are acidic. Earthworms don't do as well. So there's a lot of landscape variability in that we need to appreciate. But nonetheless, it's definitely a perturbation that's come with human use of the landscape, and in this case, bringing earthworms into the Northwoods for fishing purposes primarily.
Oh, thanks for all that, Peter. Rebecca is wondering, are there any assisted migration projects taking place in New England?
Well, colleague, botanist at Smith College, Jesse Bellemare, has been thinking about this and has published on it. I'm not an expert in this. He's tried this, has some experiments moving one of the southern species up into north in different plots. And I haven't read this paper recently enough to report on it. It's often, you can grow these in gardens. They're less successful if they're left unattended, would not be surprising. But he's thought about this very carefully, about the risks that are involved, and has pointed out that virtually none of the species that we would ever think about using in an assisted migration context would ever be considered potentially invasive. So normally that we shouldn't need to worry about that, but it's an abundance of caution in thinking about that. But even think about chestnut. As we think about reintroducing chestnut and expanding its range, as this is an iconic, incredibly important species that's been eradicated from our landscape for 100 years. What would be the consequences of massive reintroductions of chestnut into our woods if we could even do this? These systems have adjusted without chestnut. Is this a wise thing? An interesting question.
That's a good point.
Or north into where it's never been before, well up into Maine. And I have to say, they're increasing in frequency, the number of these experimental plantings that are here in Massachusetts. Of course, there were chestnuts here historically. I'm growing chestnuts, resistant chestnuts, well up into Maine where they never were historically. They're doing fine, but that's an assisted migration effectively. It's actually an interesting question, why chestnuts never got further than southern Maine and southern Michigan. We won't get started on that. But they clearly can grow much further north than that.
Elisa is wondering, sorry if I missed this, but what about herbivores and climate change?
Well, deer are a huge issue, and I'll just throw those out as that is probably the keystone herbivore that is repeatedly implicated in local species declines, and in some cases eradications. So what do we do about an overabundance of deer, of white-tailed deer? Clearly, the natural controls over deer, the natural predators have been largely extirpated. Maybe we're going to get cougars back, sometime in the future. Coyotes can take fawns, for example, or wolves if they ever reintroduce. But this is unlikely to be sufficient to control deer numbers. So this is a management problem that we're confronted with, and this is a human problem. This could be human solutions. There are strong lobbies for more deer. Hunting lobbies, or hunters, not unreasonably don't want to have it be incredibly difficult to find deer. So they tend to argue for more deer, more deer habitat. Native species proponents like myself look at deer as a pest species. So we got to come to some compromise or some understanding about where deer should be available for people who like to hunt and where deer numbers need to be controlled. But all you need to do is put up a deer exclosure fence in the forest. And you'll see, and again, I've done work with this with a former student where we had deer exclosure and enclosures and exclosures and enclosures. And it's a remarkable difference. You get many different, much more herbaceous species where you can exclude deer from a landscape than when you have them. So it's a real puzzle. There are other herbivores as well, certainly insect herbivores, but deer are the number one factor that we need to consider. But if you had another specific one in mind, there are things like defoliating insects, gypsy moths, forest tent caterpillars. These are all interesting, but don't pose a threat, certainly to our herbaceous species, that the big grazing herbivore white-tailed deer do.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Julie is wondering, she said, not knowing that a flowering pink lady slipper is more than 10 years old, I will appreciate them even more, and is wondering, is there funding for another 10 years of botanical location research?
That's a good question. Funding for botanical, the sort of survey work that Professor Burton and his colleagues did is very hard to come by, unfortunately. In fact, usually, you're looking at groups like the Nature Conservancy who can provide resources for this. It's a huge amount of work. And unfortunately, the talent-based people who can actually identify these species in the wild it's not easy, and they're becoming old and retiring and not necessarily propagating themselves. And I have to say, I looked at these results, and the number of sedges, for example, you have to be a specialist to be able to identify. I don't even go there. I don't go to sedges. I mean, it's a sedge, it's a sedge. I can identify like 2 sedges. And there are tens of, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 species of sedge. And being able to identify those in the field is a specialist task. And as I said, these specialists are becoming fewer and fewer. So it's our ability to redo these sorts of analyses is called into question. Just tracking what's going on is by no means a sure thing. So increasingly taken up by amateurs. I mean, people who are not getting funding from the government, for example. Opposed to that, I have to point out one thing, however. Resources for land conservation are going up, or at least they're going up by virtue of the Inflation Reduction Act. So if that holds together, we may be in a very brief, well-funded period for land conservation. So whether or not we know what's there, we can look at these mapping tools and at least identify really prime habitat where species could move into, even if they're not there now. But in order for that to happen, they need to be set aside. They need to be conserved, and they need to remain in forest land or in fens or whatever that natural landscape feature is. And so resources for doing that, we're looking at potentially some good times with some resources that hadn't been previously available. So that's a positive if that budget holds together. I don't have any crystal ball on that. But right now, there's some real opportunities.
Oh, that's good to know. Thanks, Peter. Does anybody have any additional? Oh, here's another one. Let's see. We have. Kim is wondering, how do we get city planning departments to do a type of study, biomap on area, before they, for instance, build a parking lot such as Cook Ave in Northampton?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, anybody can do this, and you, as a private citizen, you could go in and run biomap for a very specific area. It's really a remarkable tool, and take that to the town meeting or city council in this case, and point out if there's in fact an overlap with the core habitat, that this needs to be taken into consideration. And those are challenges that we as citizens need to sort of take upon ourselves. Or we look around at the regional conservancies that are here that are helping us, Kestrel, Valley Land Trust, others, you know, that are out there that may be able to help as well. In turn, if you know, looking at using something like Biomap, if it's not working for you, turning to a group that has some expertise in that would certainly be, you know, would be something one can do. But the Biomap, they're making every effort, and the Nature Conservancy as well, to make this available to anybody with a, you know, with a web page and a browser who can go in and actually use the resource. So I'm really quite impressed the bit that I've worked around. And as I mentioned at Kestrel, they're using this more and more to guide their conservation decisions.
Okay. Any other questions? If so, just pop them into the chat. We have a bit more time if anybody would like to ask Peter any other questions. Oh, one new message here. Anne says, I heard of a group in the UK that are plant rescuers. They go into construction areas and rescue plants.
That's a really admirable thing to do. I had a colleague at Ohio State who was a professional at that. He would go around to construction sites and grab shrubs and you know everything that he could find and give it away to his colleagues. And that's and you know one hopes that the construction people wouldn't mind, but that's it's, you know, it can be done. Now it's not always easy to keep those things alive, and that's you know, you have to be willing to follow through or you know, find good homes for those species. Being aware that you know, I'll just point out, and I think everybody here probably appreciates this, it's virtually impossible to transplant orchids and have them survive. And this is, you know, people don't get the message enough about this. You dig up a lady slipper orchid and stick it in your garden, it might last for 1 year. And this could be a 25, could be a 30-year-old plant, and it'll die guaranteed within 1 or 2 years. It just, the root systems, the mycorrhizal networks are disrupted, never works. It's possible to grow them from seed. It's possible to get, well, I think lady slipper orchids are generally not available horticulturally. And if someone were to try to sell you or give you one, you'd really want to know where it came from. And if it was propagated horticulturally, which is unlikely, but I've heard that they're getting better at doing this. That would be the only way that you would want to do it. And even then, putting it in your garden, it's unlikely to have the fungal symbionts it needs to really keep going. Appreciating them and conserving them in their native habitat is really the place where.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kim says that Framingham Garden in the Woods sells them.
Pink lady slippers. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I haven't been over to Garden in the Woods, and that's, I mean, they're Native Plant Trust. They understand what they're doing. I have friends who've worked there, and I would absolutely trust if they were, you know, if you were getting an orchid there, that they would have been raised from seed or from a clone. Nonetheless, as I'm sure they would tell you, you really got to pay attention to about where you're putting it if it's going to survive and persist. Very particular.
Anne says it might be nice to put educational posters up in areas where they are prominent to explain this to folks.
That's a very good suggestion. Don't pick the orchids. If anybody, I have to tell one more lady slipper story. I have a friend of mine who has the biggest population I've ever seen. She's up in Maine, and she founded the Wild Seed Project, and I like to go there and pollinate the orchids. And I was going there to try. There are hundreds of flowering plants, amazing population, and I was going there to try to witness pollination. Anyway, I went there one day, and many flowering plants. I went there essentially 4 or 5 days later, and some animal, presumably a deer, had gone through and eaten just the flower of every single plant. 100% reproductive failure in that population. I've never seen anything like it. They didn't even nibble the stem. They just something went through and just clipped off every single flower. It was amazing. Hundreds. It was I'd never seen anything like it. Either at Heather, my friend. So, but that can happen. That's the sort of serendipitous thing that you never know. So, no seeds that year.
That's heartbreaking to a botanist, I can imagine.
Well, the plants are still there, although many times the leaves get chewed as well. They rarely make it through unscathed through an entire season.
Susan says it happened in my woods, over 100 eaten in New Salem.
Yes, I feel your pain. The same thing.
Jan's wondering if it's chipmunks.
I doubt it was chipmunks in this case. These were, a foot off the ground, but I don't know why a deer would just eat the flowers. My first instinct is to lay the blame on deer, but that's probably unfair to the deer.
Well, Elisa says, I know the population of pink lady slippers in the Quabbin watershed became much larger or more evident when they began the deer hunt there.
Not surprising. Not surprising. They browse them they can browse them quite heavily. Another fun fact about orchids and lady slipper in particular is they go subterranean. They can decide not to put up leaves for a year or two. I'm tracking individual plants on our land in Maine, and they just go dormant. They just decide, I'm not going to put up a leaf this year. You think they're dead or something, they're gone, and then a couple of years later, they're back. And there aren't that many plants that do that. That's, to me, just very weird plant behavior.
Well, Susan says she successfully spread seeds for the patch before they were eaten.
Successfully, so would they see new plants? That would be amazing. New baby orchids.
Yeah.
I'm still waiting to see that.
All right.
We appreciate the age of many of these plants. The trilliums all have a long life cycle. So big flowering trillium, 10 years old, 15 years old, easily. These plants, again, start out very small, fungal symbionts. It takes a long time for these plants to mature and get big enough to flower, let alone become these, these great plants and these great flowering individuals that we see out in the woods, often much older than we might guess.
Yes, Susan added to that a new area nearby.
Spectacular. I'm so glad to hear that.
Well, we've got a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions.
Great.
Peter, you're such a wealth of
chatting all this great with these experienced botanists and people who've had experience with these plants. Really wonderful to share all these stories and information. I'm going to keep going with my orchid seeding, so now that I know it might work.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I just want to say thanks again for all those who attended, for those who stayed for the Q&A. Thank you, Peter. You're just so wonderfully knowledgeable and experienced in this area, and thank you for your upcoming walk on May 20th. And our last speaker in this series, Wildlife and Wild Plants in a Changing Climate, is going to be next month, and it will be on bees. We have a PhD student at Tufts who's working on his dissertation on this topic. And thank you so much for your interest in Kestrel's work, for attending this event, and for your continued support.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thanks, everybody.